Hey y'all! It's entry number 83 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Mike Evans, wide receiver, Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We'll start with the positives with Mike Evans' fantasy profile. Year-to-year consistency. Mike Evans has finished with 1,000 or more receiving yards in every single season of his career thus far. 8 seasons. In half PPR formats, he's finished as the WR12 in 2014, the WR24 in 2015, the WR2 in 2016, the WR17 in 2017, the WR9 in 2018. The WR12 in 2019, the WR10 in 2020, and the WR8 in 2021, according to Fantasy Pros. This year-to-year consistency is insane and makes Evans a more intriguing investment in fantasy leagues. The next thing I really like about Mike Evans' fantasy profile is the fact that he's a red zone monster. In terms of red zone targets, Mike Evans has seen 15 targets in 2014. Tied for the 29th most in the NFL, 19 red zone targets in 2015, tied for the 18th most in the NFL, 19 red zone targets in 2016, tied for the 17th most in the NFL, 20 red zone targets in 2017, tied for the 11th most in the NFL, 13 red zone targets in 2018, tied for the 45th most in the NFL, 17 red zone targets in 2019, tied for the 15th most in the NFL, 21 red zone targets in 2020, tied for the 10th most in the NFL, and 18 red zone targets in 2021, tied for the 16th most in the NFL according to NFL Savant. He's scored at least 8 touchdowns in 6 of his 8 seasons in the league, and is clearly one of the better wide receivers in the NFL at scoring touchdowns. The last thing I really like about Mike Evans' fantasy profile is the fact that he plays in a pass-happy offense. Last year, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers led the NFL in passing attempts with 731 according to StatMuse. And while head coach Bruce Arians has retired, the team will still have last year's offensive coordinator and play caller Byron Leftwich to call the plays. In Leftwich's career as an offensive coordinator, his team has averaged 39.19 passing attempts per game, and his wide receiver room has seen 22.31 targets per game, both of which are above average. Playing in a pass-happy offense is good for Mike Evans' fantasy value. Moving on to some of the concerns with Mike Evans' fantasy profile. Coming off a career high in touchdowns, Mike Evans scored a career high 14 touchdowns last year. While he is a major red zone threat, whenever a player comes off a career high number, there's a decent chance that we see some regression in this area, even if it's only by a touchdown or two. The next major concern I have with Mike Evans' fantasy profile is, will Tom Brady continue to evade Father Time? Brady has been an outlier in the NFL in terms of longevity, and we've been talking about the end being near for Brady since 2014, and been wrong for nearly a decade at this point. But as with any quarterback that's over the age of 40, it is something that you have to keep in the back of your mind as a slight concern, since the fall-off could happen at any point. If Brady does finally fall off the age cliff in 2022, that would obviously negatively impact Mike Evans' fantasy value. The last major thing that concerns me about Mike Evans' fantasy profile is that he's not great in terms of yards after the catch. Mike Evans had just 259 yards after the catch in 2021, which ranked 77th in the NFL. He was just one of 6 receivers to have over 1,000 receiving yards that didn't crack the top 50. The others were Stephon Diggs, who was 53rd with 1,225 receiving yards but just 326 yards after the catch. Terry McLaurin, who was 56th with 1,053 receiving yards and 317 after the catch. Kyle Pitts, who was 57th with 1,026 receiving yards and 313 after the catch. T. Higgins, who was 65th with 1,091 receiving yards and 290 after the catch. And Tyler Lockett, who was 71st with 1,175 receiving yards and 277 yards after the catch. Some additional thoughts on Mike Evans' fantasy profile. In 2021, Mike Evans finished as the WR6 in standard with 188.5 total fantasy points and 11.8 fantasy points per game. The WR8 and half PPR formats with 225.5 total fantasy points and 14.1 fantasy points per game, and the WR9 in full PPR formats with 262.5 total fantasy points and 16.4 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats, during the 2021 season, Mike Evans had 4 out of 16 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 0 out of 16 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 6 out of 16 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 2 out of 16 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 2 out of 16 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, and 2 out of 16 games with over 25 fantasy points according to fantasy data. In 2020, Mike Evans finished as the WR8 in standard with 178.6 total fantasy points and 11.2 fantasy points per game. The WR10 in half PPR formats with 213.6 total fantasy points and 13.4 fantasy points per game, and the WR11 in full PPR formats with 248.6 total fantasy points and 15.5 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats, during the 2020 season, Mike Evans had 2 out of 16 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 4 out of 16 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 5 out of 16 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 3 out of 16 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 1 out of 16 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, and 1 out of 16 games with 25 or more fantasy points according to fantasy data. Air yards. Mike Evans averaged 92.0 air yards per game, 1.67 air yards per snap, and had 26.7% of his team's air yards in 2021 according to RotoWire. Mike Evans is currently going off the board as WR11, about pick 34 overall, on ESPN, and WR8, about pick 22 overall, on Yahoo. For me, his overall ESPN ADP seems like a solid to good value, but at his overall Yahoo ADP, I would prefer to take a shot on one of the running backs going later, Saquon Barkley, Javonte Williams, and Alvin Kamara. Overall, I think that he's a safe bet to finish somewhere in the high WR2 to mid WR1 range this year based on his track record, and there's always something to be said about getting that kind of stability early in drafts. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Mike Evans' My Cause My Cleats in 2021 was for the Mike Evans Family Foundation, which is for youth education and empowerment. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.